Today we are going to be making my new sewing pattern, this lovely tiered baby doll dress. As a lot of my projects, I originally just made it for myself, but then I showed it on TikTok and a lot of you really wanted the pattern. It is a really simple pattern, but we spent a good while perfecting it. This pattern, as all my other patterns do, come in a size extra small to 6 extra large. And the 3 to 6 part is made with plus size guidelines. It is a really big poofy dress and it's also really comfortable to wear. It is a lot of fabric, and if you're a fan of wearing belts with your dresses, I don't think this one is for you. This is for all of you that love big fluffy dresses. I'm wearing it with my Darcy shirt underneath, which I think makes it so cute. This exact version is made in a Harris tweed fabric, which is 100% wool, and I absolutely love it. You can of course make it in any fabric you like. I would kind of stay away from really stretchy fabrics though, so no jersey or like stretchy satin. But I always say that you can use whatever fabric you like. You just have to know the right techniques. The first thing you're going to do is to pick your size and then print the pattern. This dress is kind of oversized, so you'll have to go by your bust measurement, and you can always size down a little bit. The size I'm wearing right now is a size medium, but I'm also going to be showing you a clip of me wearing it in size extra small. So in this dress, it's actually a lot of room to just pick the size you feel like you're closest to. If you don't like it tight around your neck, you could absolutely size up. After you've picked the size, you're going to print it at 100%. Let's go. Now we are going to assemble the pattern, and you've seen me do this a couple of times before. You are going to use this guideline here to check if the pattern has printed the correct size. Mine is exactly 3 × 3 centimeters. That's perfect. So now we are going to start to assemble it. There are some coordinates on the top of each page, and you are going to assemble the patterns according to these coordinates. So you are going to do the letters first. So you're going to take A1, B1, C1, etc. I'm just going to cut off the edge of where I'm taping, and you're just going to tape everything together. And in the next row, you're going to do A2, B2, C2, D2, E2, etc. And then I'm just going to cut out all the pattern pieces. The fabric I'm using today is the same Harris tweed wool that I've used for my dress. I am going to put out a video showing you how to line the dress. There's a lot of different ways to line dresses, and I'm going to show you my preferred way in another video. But today I'm not going to line it except the yoke part right here. You can use interfacing on the yoke if you want to. I don't feel like it's needed, even though the yoke is supporting a lot of fabric. But if you want to, you absolutely can. It kind of depends on your fabric. I'm going to show you the simplest way of doing it. So therefore, no lining and no interfacing. Now we are going to cut out all our fabric pieces. Remember to place on fold where it tells you, and to mark any notches. I'm just using my iron as a weight. It's not plugged in. So remember where it says place on fold, you are going to do so. If not, you're going to cut out. I actually really love this fabric. It's super nice, and when I first made this dress last year, I wanted to make something in wool because I usually don't do that. As you can see right here, my pattern piece doesn't really fit on the fold, especially on the larger sizes. You will probably run into this. Depending on what fabric you use, you can of course turn your pattern piece this way, but I would not recommend it for most fabrics because it will pull a little bit weird since it is kind of heavy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be piecing it a little bit. If you're using a wider fabric, you probably won't have this issue, but I'm going to show you how to do it anyways. We really don't want a seam in the front right here, so I'm going to still be placing the pattern on fold, and then we are going to piece on the sides. There are multiple ways of piecing fabric pieces like this, but I'm going to show you probably the easiest way to do it. I'm just going to be pinning and then cutting my fabric as usual. Once you get to the edge here, I'm going to be just folding the pattern piece and cutting along where it has no fabric. This is kind of the quick, easy way to do it, but I do like it. It is now really important that you know if this is the back or the front and which way is up and down. So just mark that with little post-it notes on the fabric pieces. Then I'm going to be taking some scrap fabric. Then I'm going to see if any of the pieces matches the scrap fabric. We are going to need 2 of these pieces because we have folded the fabric and there's 2 layers right here. because we are piecing the pattern together, it doesn't have any seaming allowance marked on the pattern. So it is kind of important to mark that. On the extra piece right here, you will then need 2 times the sewing allowance, one for this piece and one for this piece. So you will probably need to add 2 centimeters of sewing allowance on the side of the fabric where you've cut it. This dress has a lot of ruffles and the fabric is really expensive, and I do have a scrap piece here that fits almost perfectly, so I am going to be using that even though there's no extra sewing allowance. Then once you've cut out the pattern piece right here, I just like to pin it to the side that we are matching it with, just so I remember when I'm going to sew it. You're of course going to be doing it twice. Since we are doing such a small amount of lining on the yoke here, this is the perfect opportunity to use any scrap fabric you have lying around. For this part, I do recommend to use like a stiffer fabric because we are not doing an interfacing, so it's a kind of a good idea to have something stiff for everything to hold onto. Since the yoke are supporting a lot of weight, you should either do like a canvas or a very stiff fabric. I'm just using an unbleached cotton right here. On the dress I'm wearing right now, it actually does have a kind of a lightweight linen fabric on the lining of the yoke, and it has worked really well so far, but I do recommend to use something a little bit more tighter woven. Now we're going to finish off almost all of the raw seams. I have made a little diagram in the sewing guide for which seams you should finish, but it is almost all of them. I'm going to use my overlocker to do this. I think a lot of Americans use the word serger instead of overlocker. You can of course also do zigzag stitch if you want to. Since we are doing no lining, everything has to be finished on the inside, and I do think it came out really cute when I overlocked it. So we're just going to be serging or zigzag stitching a lot of the raw edges. If you have pieced a little bit on the bigger sections like I have right here, you can sew the seams first, press them, and then zigzag stitch them. If you have pieced a little bit, you are going to have something that looks like this on the bottom. You're now just going to press this seam flat if you haven't done it already. If you now have any wrinkles or seams or something you'd like to iron out, I would do this step now, because once we start ruffling, it will get a little bit harder to iron because we have to be careful not to iron down the ruffles. I probably will get some comments about me wearing wool without any lining, and and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about it. I am Norwegian, so we wear kind of wool sweaters on bare skin all the time, and it doesn't really bother me. But also because a lot of my clothing and all of my designs are historically inspired. So with kind of dresses like this or wool skirts or a lot of my clothing, I would wear undergarments like chemise or bloomers and a top underneath everything, and then you don't have to wash. Kind of like wool dresses like this, if that makes sense. We're going to start by sandwiching the mid-tier right here between the main fabric and the lining fabric. You're going to start by setting your machine to a long stitch length and then sewing ruffles all around the edge of the top of the mid-tier right here. You're going to do this on both the back and the front. Once you've ruffled your piece, you're going to find the notches that marks the middle on the bottom of the yoke and then the top of the mid piece, and start to pin. Then you're going to distribute the ruffles on the yoke piece right here, and I always leave just a centimeter at each end with no ruffles, just because it makes it a little bit easier to sew through it later. I like to pin it a little bit before I start to sew, just to have an idea of where the ruffles should go. Then I'm going to distribute the rest by doing it while I sew. I like to sew the ruffle part to the main part of the fabric before I stitch on the lining, just because I do think it makes it a little bit easier to distribute the ruffles nicely. Then I'm setting my machine to a little bit of a shorter stitch length, and I'm just going to be sewing with the ruffle part towards the foot so I can see where the ruffles land. Remember to leave about a centimeter or a centimeter and a half at each edge, and then I just pull and sew over the ruffles as I go. Now we are going to take our lining piece and then put it on the opposite side of the main fabric yoke. You should now again find the middle, pin it together, and then you can just kind of pin the lining all the way around. You can of course do the sandwiching at once and just leave the ruffles in between, but I think it's a lot easier to sew the ruffles down first and then just connect the lining at the end. Before you do this, you should check that your ruffles look nice, because this is the way they are going to look. So as you can see, I do have the yoke in the main fabric, then I have the ruffled piece, and at the other side I have the yoke in the lining fabric. I'm going to pin this quite meticulously so that it's a little bit easier to sew. I would also recommend to sew this with the main fabric yoke up towards the foot so you can see the stitch line that's already there. All the seams are sewn with 1 centimeter sewing allowance, if not stated otherwise in the sewing description. Now you should have a front piece that looks like this in the front and this in the back. When we're doing the next video of showing how to line the entire dress, this is actually the concept that I use on the whole dress. I don't like to have the lining just flowing by itself behind the real dress. I really like to sandwich all the layer pieces together, but that can be a little bit tricky, so I'm showing you the dress without the lining first. And before you do anything else, you will have to sew the back seams closed a little bit and iron them open. I just pinned the 2 back pieces of the yoke together, and we are going to stitch. And we're just going to stitch with a 1 centimeter sewing allowance, 6 centimeter up from the bottom. I'm just going to set a pin here and just pin it together. We are going to do this on both the lining and the main fabric. Now I'm just going to iron the seam open, and I'm also going to continue up the back piece here and iron the raw edges in 1 centimeter. This will create the opening in the back. Do this on both the lining and the main fabric. Now we are going to sandwich the mid-tier in between the 2 layers of yoke, just as we did on the front piece. You can now treat the back piece exactly the same because we have sewn together the seam at the bottom of the yoke. So once again, we are going to ruffle all around the top of the mid-tier. I'm pulling the thread so that it creates ruffles. Sometimes I like to do 2 ruffle stitches and then pull 2 threads, but you can do this however you want to. Now, once again, we are going to take our main part of the yoke and find the middle, which is very easy here because we've stitched down the whole middle. And then we're going to find where we've marked that the middle of the top right here is. Then we're just going to pin all the ruffles to the main fabric yoke here. Now it's important to do the right sides of the fabric together. So you're going to stitch with the seam that we stitched last away from the ruffle piece. And remember to leave about 1 centimeter without any ruffling. Now we are going to add our lining, and we are going to do that in the exact same way as we did on the front piece. Now it is really important that you place the right sides of the yoke together like this. So you can see the wrong side of the seam on this side, and you can also see the wrong side of the lining on this side. And we are going to do exactly as we did on the front yoke by just pinning everything together. And then we're going to sew with the main fabric up towards the foot. I'm just literally stitching over the stitch line that we already have. And then you should have the back side of the dress. Now we are going to attach the bottom piece together with the mid-tier piece. So again, we're going to start by ruffling the top of the bottom piece right here. This is quite a simple dress to make, but I think that the only part that can be a little bit challenging is to arrange the ruffles, which can take some time, but it turns out so nice, so it's totally worth it. Now it's also very important to go and mark all the notches. If you haven't done so already, you should at least have a mark in the middle of the mid-tier right here. But if you want to, you can also separate it into more pieces so that it makes it a little bit easier for ruffling. I've made some notches on the pattern, so you can also just follow them. With this wool fabric I'm using, it's a little bit hard to permanently just mark the notches. So I'm just going in and marking it after I've sewn, just because I feel like the marks disappear really quickly. So it's kind of no use putting them in before I really need to. So then we are just going to sew all the pieces right here and matching the notches. So we're going to do right sides together and then start ruffling. There are multiple ways of sewing ruffles, but I do like this way by just marking up everything and then pinning the small batches together, if that makes sense. Like I said, I have drawn a diagram in the sewing instructions. Then you're just going to sew the bottom tier to the mid tier, and you will have an almost finished dress that looks like this. This is the back side, and now we're going to do the same thing on the front. I'm going to show you one more time. You're going to take your top piece right here, and then you'll have to make sure that you've marked all the notches on the pattern. All the sizes are divided into 4, so I'm not going to go over and check my pattern. I'm just going to fold it and pin it so it's 4 equal parts, but you can always follow the notches on the pattern. I'm going to do this on both the bottom of the mid tier and also the top of the bottom tier right here. You may not think it matters that much because the bottom tier pattern looks really similar both in the front and in the back. And it kind of looks like a long rectangle, but it is kind of graded differently in each size, and it is also longer and more curved on the bottom back, for example. So it is really important that you do make sure that the up on the pattern piece is facing upwards and the bottom as well. And you shouldn't mix the back and front. Even though they look quite similar, they're actually quite different, and you will end up with a dress that doesn't really look quite right. I'm now also kind of dividing the bottom tier into 4 equal parts. Depending on the size you are making, you may want to divide it up even further. I'm making the size extra large, and I find that 4 parts is enough, but you can also just follow the pattern guidelines. Now I'm just going to sew a long ruffle thread throughout the whole top of the bottom tier right here. Now we're just going to start to place the ruffles on the bottom edge of the mid tier right here. And you're going to do this right sides together. So you are going to find the edges, pin them together. And as I said, I do like to leave about 1 centimeter without ruffles to make it easier to sew through later when we are doing the side seams. And then you are going to find the next markings and you're going to pin those two together. Then you're going to find the next markings and so on and so forth. That way I feel like it's a little bit easier to just adjust the ruffles as you sew, because you don't have that much fabric to sew over. In a size XL, this is how much you are going to need to ruffle at a time, which I don't think is that much, so you can just do it by eye when you are sitting at the machine. Of course, you can start pinning it now and pinning all the ruffles, but I do like to do it by eye. Then when you get to the first marking, you are just going to spread out the ruffles a bit more and keep on sewing. So now you're going to have 2 pieces that looks like this, and that means that you're actually almost finished with your dress. Now we are going to sew the shoulder seams, and we are going to do this on both the back and the front pieces. And we are going to do this by taking first the main fabric and putting the shoulders right sides together, pin it, and then sew. We are going to do this on both sides. If you now have one of the sides that seem a little bit longer than the other, maybe because it's cut not completely straight on the fabric, you should absolutely have the tighter side up against the foot when you sew. Again, I'm sewing with 1 centimeter sewing allowance. And now we're just going to press all the seams open. Now we are going to sew the neckline together. And to do this, you are going to have to turn your dress kind of inside out. And this can be a little bit finicky. So I'm just going to put a mark halfway through the neck opening right here on both the lining and the main fabric. There are a lot of ways to sew tops like this, and if you're an experienced sewer, you probably have your favorite way of doing it. but I've tried to figure out the simplest way of doing it, and I think that this is a good way. You're then going to turn the fabric in towards the arm opening here. You're then going to just turn everything inside out so that the pieces line up from the inside. It is really important to remember that you are going to sew the right sides of the pieces together. So no raw edges towards each other, just away. Then I'm going to pin. I'm going to start in the back and pin the opening first. Then I'm going to pin the shoulder seams together and put a pin in the middle. Then we are going to find our halfway marks and pin them together in the neck opening. And then I'm just continuing to kind of pull out the rest of the fabric here so that you have every piece. This will be a little bit tight at the end here, but that's okay. Then we are going to just keep on pinning, finding the shoulder seams and pinning them together. And then at last finding the edges and pinning them together as well. Then we are going to sew with the tightest fabric up towards the foot, like always. In my case, that is the canvas lining. And we are just going to start to sew. If you want to open the neckline a bit right here because you feel like it's too tight, you would just sew with a bigger sewing allowance, for example 2 centimeters instead of 1, and that will kind of lower the neckline all around. But if you're a bit unsure, or if you haven't made a mock-up like you totally should, you're going to flip it, try it on, and then decide if you want to sew it a bit lower before you start cutting into it. I'm going to go into all the curved pieces right here. For example, this is from the back to the shoulder seams, and I'm going to snip a couple of lines right here. Depending on the size, the neck opening will be kind of steeper or looser. So I would recommend to snip a few where you see that it's a little bit curved, flip it, try it on, and then maybe go and see if it's kind of pulling on the fabric to see if you need to snip more. We do this because when we sew curves, the sewing allowance will kind of pull on the seam and not look as nice. So we want to open it so that the fabric can spread evenly. Just be sure not to cut over where you sew. Then you are going to just flip it back. And now we do have a very, very nice neckline right here. And you can try it on to see if it fits you. Now I'm just going to iron the neckline down with the lining towards the iron. And you should now see that the lining kind of lays very flat and doesn't get pulled or anything like that. If it is pulling a bit and you find that you can't really smooth it out quickly, you should go in, turn it around, and then cut a few more notches. Now you can also see that the back seam right here lays very nicely, and if we just sew it right now, it will be closed shut with no raw edges. Now you should try it on again and see if you have any pulling of the lining up over the front of the dress right here. If you have used a stiff enough fabric and if you made sure to sew the lining into the middle part right here, up towards the bodice, you shouldn't really have any pulling of the lining. If you do have it, you can always go in and understitch right here. I wanted this video to be quite beginner friendly, so I'm not going to do any understitching because I feel like that can be a little bit hard if you've not sewn a lot before. I feel like I don't have any pulling of the lining right here because it lays very flatly against the neck opening. So I'm not going to do any understitching, but you can if you want to. That would be the more normal way to do it for professionals. Now we are going to sew the arm opening right here, and you're going to do this by pulling the whole piece inside out by the opening in the back. Then you should pin the shoulder seams first and then the edge right here. Here we have sewn the skirt piece into the opening, and to make it as beginner friendly as possible without having to do any weird tricks, I'm just going to be pinning it together about 1 centimeter away from this seam right here, and I'm going to start and stop sewing 1 centimeter away from this part right here. That is going to be hand stitched later. And now we're actually just going to do the same as we did in the neck opening and sew everything together. I'm just going to sew with 1 centimeter sewing allowance and start and stop about 1 centimeter away from the seam right here. And then you should probably check to see that you haven't caught any of the middle part into the seam. But we are then going to snip the seams in the curves like we did on the neck piece right here. You can absolutely do this by eye, it doesn't really matter, just as long as you snip where the seam is a little bit curved. If you find it kind of hard to turn and match everything together with the wrong way in and out, you can absolutely hand stitch the whole top of the dress if you want to. When I started sewing when I was young, I used to do that all the time. Then we can turn it around and you should have a lovely dress. Now the part that we didn't sew, about a half a centimeter, is going to look like this. That means that the raw edge is going to be turning inwards. Later we are going to iron this down and then hand stitch this fold right here so it doesn't have any raw edges from the outside. Then we're just going to be ironing the seam right here with the lining side up towards the iron. One thing that I really like about this design, and I think makes it a little bit prettier than a lot of pinafore dresses, is that the shoulder part right here kind of goes in a curve outwards. And I think that's really, really cute because usually it would just be turned in like this. And I think this looks a lot cuter. I'm just going to go into the back seam right here, which is still open, put my hand around and pull the shoulder seams right here through the opening. Then I am placing them with the right sides together in the seam right here, and I am pinning, and I'm going to just pull the rest through the hole as well and pin it down. And I'm going to leave about a centimeter at both ends where the mid tier meets the yoke right here. Then I'm going to sew with the canvas part up towards me because I always want the tightest part up towards the foot because I then find it a little bit easier to sew. Keeping 1 centimeter from the edge, I'm going to stitch with the 1 centimeter sewing allowance through the hole of the arm opening. Then I'm going to snip where all these seams are a bit curved. I'm going to turn it back right side out. And I'm going to iron with the canvas part towards me. You can, of course, if you want to, go in and understitch this seam right here as well, if you feel like you need to do that. Now we are going to do the side seams, and then your dress is almost finished. I'm just going to cut off any loose threads at each side, and we are going to take the dress right here, turn it inside out, and then we are going to start to match up all the seams. I'm setting a needle in the top part, then I'm putting a needle in the middle part. Since we are not pressing any seams open, I'm going to just do this with my fingers right now and match up the seam and put a needle in it. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a good example of one of the parts being cut slightly more on the bias than the other. So we are going to stretch it a little bit because the bottom piece right here seems to be a little longer than the top part. To fix this, we are just going to pull a little bit on the fabric to kind of find where the middle pieces align, put a needle in it, and do this a couple of more times. It really depends on how you cut the fabric if you get this issue or not. As I said, it usually just means that one of the pieces are cut slightly more across the grain line and not completely on it. Now I'm just going to sew with the slightly more shorter side up towards the foot. And I'm also going to be pulling a bit and making sure that the fabric underneath lays flatly when I sew. Then you shouldn't have any problem with bunching. And now you should have one of the side seams completely sewn together. And we are going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Again, I am pressing the seam a bit flat here and pinning it down and making sure to match the seams. Now I'm just going to iron these seams open, and I'm being a bit careful so that I don't iron over any of the ruffles because we don't want them to be flat. But I am ironing in the seam right here. That's why we kind of haven't ruffled that part right here. Then I'm just going to be ironing the bottom piece of the armhole right here down. If you do have like a serger and the seam here is kind of nice, you don't really have to do this, but I'm going to do it anyways. Because if you've sewn with a zigzag zigzag stitch. It looks a bit nicer when you just iron it down. It is a little bit hard to iron the wool, but as you can see, you're just going to be creating a fold. You can also pin it down and just hand stitch later. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm just going to hand stitch the bottom of the armhole right here. And I'm just going to be using a thread that's very, very similar in color to the dress so that it doesn't peek through. I'm just doing short stitches all around the arm opening. I do like to finish a lot of my pieces by hand. You of course could stitch this on the machine, but it looks so much nicer if you just do it by hand. And I feel like when you already have spent so much time making a piece of clothing, it's really nice to make the finishing touches really clean. Now when we get to the edge right here, I'm just making sure that I sew quite close to the edge while the part here is still folded, and I will also go up into the yoke piece kind of and fasten the thread. To get this neat can be a little bit finicky, but I think it turns out quite nice. Since we are doing all hand stitching now, I'm also going to finish the back seam right here. I have actually worn this dress I'm wearing right now without any type of closing in the back for a while, and I think it looks really cute without anything. It just makes a V-split, and then the dress is really comfortable because you kind of have a lot of room in the back of the neck. But if you want to have a type of closure, you can do either a bow or you can do a button. On this dress today, I'm going to be doing a button and a loop, which I think will be very cute. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. You kind of now have to figure out where you want the button. I like to have a little bit of opening right here, so I don't want to put it that far down, but I'm going to put it about 4 centimeters down, so it will make a very nice split. Now I'm just going to make a button hoop. I'm going to be taking a piece of scrap fabric and just cutting it on the grain line. I think I'm going to make the loop preferably as small as possible, and that's kind of difficult with the wool, but I'm going to make a long piece that's about 2 centimeters, and I'm actually going to iron it first. So I have a kind of a long bias tape piece like this, and I'm going to be folding it once in like this and then stitching down this edge right here. Then I have my finished loop right here, so I'm just going to cut it a little bit. And then I'm going to be placing it where I've marked. It can be a good idea to sew on the button first, just so that it's a little bit easier to place the button loop. So I just finished off the seam on one of the sides, and I'm just going to be attaching the button. If you are going to be tugging on your dress a little bit and you know you get irritated, it is probably a good idea to fasten the button into the lining at least once, just to make sure that it's fastened correctly. Then you can try the loop and see if it fits around the button. Mine fits actually pretty well. And you're also going to be checking the placement like this. And now, without stitching in the lining, you can just sew over this a couple of times with the machine. You can of course just fasten the loop when you sew it by hand later, but I find that it's a little bit more secure if you just do that part with machine first, and I think it looks okay. Then you will have a very cute button and button loops that looks like this, and the dress is completely finished on the inside, and I think by closing it by hand it just looks so nice. I do this on all the pieces I produce as well. How cute! Now you are just going to hem it however you want. You can do 1 fold or you can do 2 fold. I'm going to hem mine by hand by ironing down a couple of centimeters and then just hand stitching all around the edge. And then you have your completely finished dress. I think it looks so nice. This is how it looks with a button closure, and you still have some room here, which I think is really nice. Here it also is with some bow ribbons, which I think turned out very cute. You can of course do thinner ribbons in another fabric if you want to, or if you have a thinner fabric, they will turn out a little bit thinner. So yeah, here you have it. I really hope you liked my tutorial. I do have 2 other sewing patterns already out, a pair of bloomers and a skirt. If you enjoyed it, remember to subscribe and like the video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and maybe I or someone else will answer them for you.